I am the great-grandchild of Mary Kozma, who immigrated to this country. As far as we know, that she was the first, because she owned, between King Street and Orange, she owned a property, a store in the middle of that block, but she owned all the way through to Prince Street. And in the middle of that property, she had a two-story house. And I was told that by my mother that when each Lebanese couple or family would come, they would stay with her till they found a place. Of course, a lot of them stayed over the stores because they had a business downstairs, and they stayed over the stores. She came alone to this country. Whether her husband was widowed or whether she left him, we don't know. But she did bring with her a son, and I won't say he was the oldest because we don't know this, because he could read and write and spoke 3 languages. And so that was her way of being able to do business. She left my grandmother, her daughter, Latifi Kozma, who married an Assy. She left her in French convent school over there. And at 16, she sent for her because Mary had picked out someone for her to marry. Never knew who it was. I could guess that it could be a Curie from Columbia because they were very, very close. So she comes and she sees we called him Papa Assy, John Assy. And I think on both ends it was love at first sight. And she defied her mother. And she married him. The fact that she's not in a wedding gown and her mother's not in the picture, I do not believe her mother went to the wedding or the marriage ceremony, which had to be at St. Mary's. So we know that, and to the day Mary died, she never spoke to him. Refused to speak to her. Assy. Right, John Assy. But he said to her when they wanted to marry, I will make it easy for her. I will do well, and he did. He did very, very well. Mary had another child. And I think it was a son who did not come. And I only found this out recently from Angel Curie because his son used to come and visit the Assys in Lebanon because one of his family had married an Assy. So he would come every Sunday to visit. Well, a lot of small places were advertising all over for people to come and open businesses and come live here. And I'm assuming that's what she was doing. Now, I did ask her daughter. Her daughter would not tell you anything. My grandmother, Latifi, would not tell you anything. Finally, towards her end, I did ask her again, why did y'all come? And she said, we were tired of the Turks prosecuting us. And at the turn of the century, the Ottomans had conquered that country, and therefore they were persecutors, just like today. If you didn't become a Muslim, they chopped your head off, and they were tired of being persecuted. That was the Kozmas. That's why they came. I would imagine she also came for economic reasons too, although they were from the upper class of Lebanon. The Kozmas. No, the Basharas and the Kozmas. Now, one reason my great-grandmother didn't like my grandfather, John Assy, Sr., was because he came from the poor class. He was not educated. He came over here at 15 or 16. His brother, Charlie Assy, was already here. He had a store just south of the town clock, just west of the sound clock, a grocery store. And I'm sure he sent for him. He told him to come. My grandfather at that time was a shepherd. We had the pipes, shepherd's pipes made with cane. And it has the stops and all. And they had a number of children. The oldest one was John Jr., John Thomas Jr., who married Helen McGuire from Charleston. He met her, she was a nurse, he met her while he was in med school. He was born 8/31/1911, and he died 6/7/1990. He was a doctor in Georgetown. His first cousin was a doctor, but he was 10 years older. So he was a doctor in the 20s, late 20s, when my uncle became one in the 30s. In the late 20s, you know, we were in the midst of the Depression. And who was moving down here? All the millionaires. And they were buying up all the plantations. And so he was the doctor to them. And if you go over to Baruch's place, even in the village, the slave village, two doctors came once a week for them, and he was one of them. The next one was Mamie Assey Dalzell. She was the one that my grandfather relied on for business. None of the other children had to do anything. Can I regress and go back to Miss Mary? Miss Mary was, as most immigrants, regardless of the nationality, the son was the one. And when her daughter had my son, John, and the other children, she would fix a little bag of penny candy. And she'd line her grandchildren up, and she'd give one to each girl and give the whole bag to the boy. She was a coveted employee. She worked at the post office. She worked various places. She actually ran she was the secretary, but she ran the Coca-Cola bottling company for Mr. Woodcock, because he just sat back and let it happen. She ran it. And we had here the Coast Guard station, and her husband came, or her husband-to-be was stationed here. He walked into the post office where she was working at the time and said, "That's who I'm marrying." His name was Joe Dalzell. He was from Chattanooga, Tennessee, from an Irish family. Mamie's name was not Mamie. Mamie's name was Yasmin. And when my Uncle John was to get married, she was to be in the wedding, and the priest said, "No, you have to have a saint's name." So he gave her the name Mamie, which is an Irish name for Mary. So that's how she got married. That's how she got married. She never used Yasmin. They never referred to her as Yasmin. She was Mamie the whole life, the rest of the life. They then he got stationed to Long Beach, California, and she went. She was miserable. Miserable. So she decides the best thing to do is get a job. So story has it that she sent to Joe Parrish for a letter of recommendation, and the letter came back to her, and "Excuse me, get the hell back here and you can have any job in this town you want." Now, I'm like 6 years old at this point, and I remember her leaving, but then I remember her almost coming right back. Well, both of them came back. And I asked her before she died, when she was still lucid, I said, how during a wartime did he get stationed back in Georgetown? She said, well, Uncle John, her brother, my uncle, pulled a few political strings in Washington and got her stationed back here. him stationed back here. So they came back. He had been in, I guess you would call it radio telecommunications now, whatever, in the service, and it was really telephones then. And after the war, some businessmen in Georgetown, my Uncle John, one of them, invested in a radio station. And he got the two of them to run it and manage it. But they weren't happy with working for other people, so shortly afterwards they bought them out. And so husband bought them out. It was the first radio station in Georgetown, WGTN. And those of us that lived here and all knew it, yeah, they were connected with Mutual Broadcasting. But then they had local programs and all of that.
They had a Friday night program, Thursday night program that Jersey DiBiase.
Yeah, it was a sports, sports. And then they had children's program like Saturday morning, like children that played the piano, sang. They had an hour-long program. Anybody could come. It didn't matter. Nobody was selected. They had some morning shows for women, broadcast out of Belk's department store, which is now Augustus, Carolina. They broadcast from upstairs. My uncle was with that program too, and he said he's up there ready for it to begin 1 minute, and Mamie is not there, and he gets all nervous. But every time she slid into that chair just in time to be there. She was one of these people that had beaucoup things going on. So they stayed here till they died. She never wanted to go anyplace or even visit any place. And she was happy in Georgetown, thought it was the most wonderful place there was. And then the next child was born in 1915, Matilda. And she died in 1936, 16 years old, if you do the subtraction. They were living over the store, and there was steps were in the backyard, outdoor steps. And my grandmother had asked her to put some, there was a potbelly stove up there, and she asked her to make the fire a bit, hotter. She threw the kerosene on the flame, and it came back at her, and she ran out and down those stairs. My grandmother could not get to her, and she burned to death. She lasted about 24 hours, but she burned to death. And the strong one in my family, Aunt Mamie, was the one that had to take over and stay with her and all that. Then it came to my mother, Rosa, and she was, I always said until my cousin John reminded me of something, that she was the only one that was not.
She was much more sedate.
Sedate. But then my cousin John said, oh no, she had her mind of her own too, because she eloped and married my father, Edward Lilly from Columbia. He had been here with the CCC camp. That's how they met. He was in the CC camp with Legree Hamilton and a number of people that stayed in Georgetown. Chandler, Stuart Chandler. There was a whole bunch of them. They just married people and stayed. Now, she was just a housewife. She didn't do anything extraordinary but have me. And 24 years later had my sister Susan. Lillian and Jesse. They died as babies. One, the nurses used to take them in front of customs building. Okay, and the nurses would sit there with the babies in the prams or the strollers, and one of them got bit by something. And that night they called the doctor because the baby was feverish and it was swollen, and he didn't lance it, so the baby died. Jessie, somewhere she died as a child or baby, we don't know. And so those were the children, 1, 2, 3, 4. There actually were 6. Mamie had no children, but all her nieces and nephews were her children.
Yeah. And the rest of the town.
And the rest of the family, whatever, yeah. My Uncle John had 6 children. Now, they went by the name Assey, so they go through the Asseys. He had John, he had James, he had Jane, Michael, Robert, and Tim. And they all, Michael died. He was a doctor. He was the only one that became a doctor, too. And he passed away at 50-some years of age. He was living in Charleston. Timmy and Jane still live in Charleston. James lives in Columbia, and John lives in Nashville. And they each have children. They had a store on Front Street. Actually, they had the store, but they also peddled in the country, which a lot of people did at that time. And then her son took over the store after she died, and he married Wadia Massid. They had 3 children. The oldest one was, I think, Edward. He was the oldest. And he died, he was born in 1919. He was an electrician at International Paper Company, and he was up on the pole and doing some repairs and onto wires over there, and someone was supposed to have turned the power off and they didn't. He was electrocuted. The next one was Maggie, who married John Isaac, who was the brother of T.E. Isaac. And she had 3 children. They did not stay together, but she raised 3 children: John, Francis Isaac, Edward Isaac, and Robert Isaac. And then Manira. Manira was a nurse. She never married. She worked as a nurse in Charleston. She did very well. She moved up the ladder. Then she moved to Gainesville, Georgia, and she was connected, I believe, with the University of Georgia and their school, and when they built hospitals, she was the consultant for how the room should be from the perspective of the nurse and the doctor. So she did very, very well. The 2, Wadia and Joseph, came every night to my grandparents' house on Orange Street to play cards. And every night they played cards. Afterwards, Angel and her husband came and played with my grandparents.
Stayed with them for a while.
They lived with them for a while. Yeah. And that was another thing. Even though my great-grandmother let the Lebanese people stay in her house, my grandmother let various people. Angel's husband lived with my grandparents. Yeah. We always said he was more assy than he was a rod. Yeah.
Yeah, he was.
And before him, his brother lived with my grandparents on Orange Street. They moved from the store shortly after the girl burned to death, and my grandfather built the house on the southeast corner of Orange and Prince. They lived there till they died. Mamie inherited it. She was she inherited the house because she and her husband moved from her house when my grandparents got real old to take care of them. They never went back to their house. And my uncle, the doctor, Dr. John Assey, lived next door because my grandfather had built the house for them and an office next to it. So his office was next to it.
On Prince Street?
On Prince Street, all of it on Prince Street. And then he built a house for my mother and I down at the foot of Front Street, 205 Front Street. Real young, we lived over the store. And then we moved to Charleston, and I lived in Charleston, and then when my father had to go in the service, we moved back and stayed in Georgetown. And so all that period my father was in service, I lived on Orange Street. Then a year or so afterwards, then we moved down to Front Street.
And the store that you lived over, was that on?
908 Front Street. It was my grandfather's store, right. And he was still running it.
Right.
But, you know, they didn't have anything, so they, and my father went to work for International Paper Company, And but then he went to the naval shipyards in Charleston. That's why we went to Charleston. He did not sell meats. He did have some things like bologna and stuff like that, but he was not. But his big thing was produce. And he had some of the most beautiful fruits and all that you ever wanted. And you know how the streets of Georgetown flood? Well, in those days, there was very little to no crime in Georgetown. You never locked your doors. You left the keys in your car all night long. And when he would, during the summer, when he would go out in the country and buy a field of watermelons, he would stack them 3 or 4 high in front, and then it was like that in big double doors. And one morning he came down, and he was always in good pants, nice shoes, white shirt and tie. He came to work, I don't know it as he got older, because I was away then, but he always came down. And when he was a young man, it was fashionable to have a cane. Well, he always had a cane. He didn't need the cane, he just had the cane. It was a carryover. And we had Georgetown had flooded. We'd had an extra high tide, and all the watermelons were floating in Front Street. And we had a picture of him with his pants rolled up and the cane gathering the things. I mean, these are just low human interest stories. And then there was a place in the back, and in my life it was boarded up in the back of the store, because they owned all the way to Orange Street, the back of the store in Orange Street. And there was this great big opening, and my mother said that when the people from the countries, from the country, from the plantations, white and black, came on Saturdays, and they would buy everything they needed. And he carried like 100-pound bags of rice, 50-pound bags of rice, 25 pounds of rice, and then bins with loose rice of different kinds of rice. Anyway, when it was time to go, they would back the wagons up to that big thing in the back, big door or entryway in the back, and they would load the wagons and they would go back to the country. You had the customs house. Then the next building in my life was the Coast Guard Center. Then there was a big open lot, and that's where they parked all the wagons. And on Saturdays, I can remember all the wagons being there. And I can remember as a child, and maybe some of the Isaacs will tell you, but Annie Catherine's, who married T.E. Isaac, her father was the iceman, and he would come down Front Street with the I don't know if it was a mule or horse, I can't remember, and a buckboard type thing with the big blocks of ice, and people would buy their ice, and I can remember that.
I remember having, they have an ice house.
Yeah, and of course, you know, once they modernized, they did get refrigerators and all, but I mean, everybody bought ice. They were not the educated people, and they came for a better life.
Yeah. Okay.
And they came, as I was told, both of them came as teenagers, although there was about an 8-year age gap between them. And so Charles had a grocery store in the 600 block of Front Street. And I just imagine he encouraged my grandfather John to come. Mm-hmm. John worked for him until he could open his own grocery store at 908 Front Street. And I told you he bought several lots. I went through that. Sold one to Frank Danzig to open a 5 and dime. And the Danzigs came from Austria, fleeing Hitler. And he helped all the Lebanese people. My mother said no one ever knew because he did this at midnight. During the Depression, a number of the Lebanese family had it hard. And after he would close the store, he closed the store at 12 o'clock every night. So people were shopping until then, and he said, well, someone might need a loaf of bread, and he would keep it open. He would box up boxes of grocery, and at 12 o'clock at night he would drive to their house and just shove it on their porch. He did very well, and so he was willing to help everybody. He considered all the Lebanese his people. Now, in the early days, now the children were young, they lived over the store, and they had this big backyard in the back of the store. And that was the gathering place every Sunday for the Lebanese people. And that book I was referring you to, the Italians did the same thing. They even did the same things. Of course, the women would fix the foods, and they had contests. And the contests were contests of strength. And in this book that I read about the Italians, their contests were strength. Well, the one that won was John, my grandfather. He won everything. And so this whatever came from both sides on my family. And they would do that. Now, after they built the house on Orange Street in 1935, yeah, it was before I was born, then Sunday nights they all met at his house. He had big living room and a big dining room. And they had, the dining room was covered with foods. Now, after I was born and living there, when my father was in the service, my Aunt Mamie and them had bought them a console record player and gotten Lebanese music records. And so they would dance. Most of those, you know, the males danced. And who's leading the dance with the white handkerchief but my grandfather? He was really something, and loving every minute of all these people in his house. And he considered them, you know, his people, whether there was blood or not. And I think that was true on both ends. The Lebanese went from house to house. They called the non-blood ones auntie. Her grandmother was Aunt Catherine. The Isaac Catherine was Auntie Catherine. So everybody was uncle or aunt, even though we weren't, because they were so close. And most of them came from the same place.
Yeah, they all came from Liba.
Liba.
You know, yeah.
Whereas my grandmother came from Sagbin or something like that. The first generation born here could understand a little Lebanese, but they didn't speak any of it. I knew nothing but the bad words.
Oh, me too.
Because my cousins were all boys, and they would tell me the bad words. But anyway, so it was always, once they came here, they were Americans.
Yeah.
They assimilated. They intended to assimilate. They became a part of this country, a part of Georgetown, a part of everything. It wasn't that they in fact, they didn't even live in the same area. Even though Georgetown was small, they lived all over town. So they didn't have a conclave, and they didn't maintain that. They were Americans. They wanted their children to be Americans, and that's how it was. I remember my mother saying in the Depression, well, they were young. She said they didn't feel it so bad because they had food from the store, and people were buying, even though they didn't have a lot of money, and sometimes it was barter. And then I remember my Uncle John, who was one of their children, who was the doctor. And he, even though the Depression had gone, this is still a poor area. And I can remember he would get chickens or what have you from his patients who couldn't pay. And as a little child, we were allowed to go into the office. And he got most of his patients. He came in 1937 is when he finished and came back to Georgetown, because the International Paper Company was open then. And Dr. Seo was the new doctor too at that same time. And Philip had his own practice. So Philip, I might have gotten some of this too, but International Paper Company, when all these young men came in and they say, well, who do we go to for doctor? They said, the first one, they'd say, oh, you go to Dr. John Assey. Next one, you go to Dr. Seo. Next one, you go to Dr. Philip. And they that's how they got started their practices in Georgetown. And, but I remember as a child, he also had a lot of black patients who had nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I can remember we were allowed to go into the front office during the day and go in when he had no patients to visit him in his office area. And I can remember sitting out there waiting just to say good morning to him, and he would leave the door cracked, especially if it was a woman, and they'd say, "How much I owe you, Doc?" And he said, "Just give me 50 cents. And he did not charge him. To the day he died, he never charged his old patients that stayed with him more than $5. But he was good to the people of Georgetown, and they were good to him. I mean, his patients, when he semi-retired, they didn't want to go to another doctor.
No.
And till he completely had to quit, he made house calls. They actually belonged to the Maronite rite, not the Roman rite, but it was still Catholic Church. And there was no Maronites here. The church was a very, very important part of their lives. I can remember when my grandfather would close up every night, the store. Now, the church was only a block that way and a block that way, and the store was a block this way. He would get in the car, ride by the church, and never got out of the car, but he would say good night or thank God for what he had, and he'd come home every night. He never missed a beat. But when he went to church, he sat on the coping until it was ready to stop, and he'd go in. And then he'd come back out when the priest would give the sermon and sit on the coping until he finished, and then he'd go back in.
He would not listen to the sermon?
No, he didn't want to listen to the sermon. Oh, he was a character. They were made to sit in the back pews of the church. They could not sit anywhere. And at some point, and I don't know what priest did it, did away with that. And I could remember going to church one Sunday with my grandmother, and she's pulling me down the aisle and go in the back pew. One of the back pews, and she said no, and she went up to the middle of the church and went in a pew. And I tell you who was the mainstay about that, making them sit in the back, was William Morgan and his family.
William Morgan?
Yeah, he was not the angel that everybody makes him out to be. The Morgan sisters wanted altar society. Take care of the linens and the wines and the candles and all that. But they did not want the Lebanese to be a member. Well, my grandmother, she wanted to be a member, and some of the others too. And so Mrs. Cathu, Rainey Cathu's mother, and my grandmother were good friends. And Mrs. Cathu told the Morgan sisters, well, I'm telling you right now, if Mrs. Assey isn't a member, there will be no altar society. And there was an altar society, and we were members. Yeah. And that, so there was prejudice on some people's parts. And my grandmother and her brother were better educated than some of the people many of the people in Georgetown. But the mere fact that they,
That's so true. Immigrants even today.
Oh, I know, it is true. It is true. But the difference is with a lot of them, they don't want to assimilate. And that's the difference. It's just like, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But they wanted to because it offered them so much. When they sent for my grandmother, remember she's in a convent school with the French nuns, and she came by herself. Oh, they all came. The Asseys and the Kozmas all came first class. They did not go through Ellis Island, and I think maybe the same with y'all, but I'm not sure.
Where did they go through?
Philadelphia. And because they came through first class, they didn't have to do anything but register when they got where they went. So she came by herself, on the ship by herself, came into Philadelphia, got the train, got off in King Street. Well, Mary, her mother, the first one that came, she was the major domo of the Lebanese people, apparently. And remember, I didn't know her. she gave all the Lebanese people money and said, now you go buy the finest wardrobe for her. Well, she stepped off the train in King Street in the finest of French couture, I'll put it that way, because Miss Mary had been sending money to those nuns, and they were dressing her and what have you, and I'm sure when she was ready to come, they packed her bag. And I always thought that was kind of cute, but Miss Mary, how she was ruling the Lebanese people.